Hey Bio30. Okay, so this is the next video on the brain. We're going to do the lobes of the brain now. We just finished talking about the hemispheres and split brain experiments. So we've got the cerebellum, and the cerebellum is the majority of your brain, and it contains four lobes. Um, we then have the hypothalamus, which is a small little itty bitty chunk at the bottom of your brain. Its purpose is to regulate metabolism, temperature, hunger, sleep, sex drive, thirst, all of that stuff. The pituitary gland, we've already discussed quite a bit. It had two lobes, right? Anterior and posterior pituitary, right? We talked about those in the endocrine section of our Bio30 unit. The pons is kind of below that central brain area, above the in the brainstem, kind of, and it's a relay station. It kind of connects things between the brain, spinal cord, and the cerebellum. The medulla oblongata has autonomic nervous system control. So remember, like your parasympathetic, sympathetic nervous system, right over here. The cerebellum is primarily for balance, and it's kind of the base and the back of your brain. It's the cerebellum that was that little lump at the beginning of the last video, behind the big lump we said, right? We said we saw like a cat's brain, a human brain, and a couple other brains, and dolphin's brain, and the large lump was your cerebrum, and the smaller lump was the cerebellum. It's involved in balance. Then, of course, you've got your spinal cord connecting that. So the cerebrum is that largest portion of the brain. It's got all the folds, also called gyri. And it's the largest part of the brain. It's got the most highly developed portions of the brain in all organisms, especially humans. And its role it spans everything from speech to reasoning to memory to personality. And the four lobes are as follows: occipital, temporal, parietal, and frontal. And it's divided into those two hemispheres. We already discussed that, the left and the right hemisphere. The cerebral cortex is the surface. The cortex is the actual outer surface of the cerebrum, made up of gray matter, which is why brain injuries can be very dangerous because they don't repair. There's no myelination. And there's lots of folds. We call those gyri or fissures or sulci, convolutions, the little folds inside of the brain, inside of that cerebrum, and that's increasing surface area. So the more surface area you have, the more neuron and brain matter you have to process. And so those fissures are the folds. The hypothalamus is designed to regulate body temperature and metabolism. It controls hunger, thirst, sleep, sex drive. The pituitary gland, we've already discussed this in great detail in our endocrine videos, and it's that master gland. It controls lots of other tropic hormones, and because it controls other glands in the body. It's controlled by that hypothalamus that we just had a section on. And it's really small, like the size of a pea. Cerebellum is that back brain, kind of call it the hind brain. It's the thing that's going to control muscle tone and balance and limb movement, kind of like a little brain. Only 10% of the mass of the brain is in the cerebellum, but it contains like 50% of the brain's neurons. So that hind brain, that little cerebellum, is actually very important and vital to a properly functioning brain. And all of our higher level, I guess I shouldn't say higher level, I should say lower level, balance-based body regulation control is in that cerebellum. The medulla and the pons are going to be communication sections. So the pons is a relay station between the left and right hemisphere, along with the medulla oblongata. And the medulla oblongata itself is going to be primarily for autonomic nervous system control. So that sympathetic, parasympathetic, fight or flight stuff that we discussed in a previous video. Everything from heart rate to breathing to blood pressure, all of that involuntary stuff that you seem to take care of just fine every day without even thinking about it. That's the medulla's sort of purpose. Okay, so my favorite part of anything regarding the nervous system is discussing the lobes of the brain. We've got the frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal lobes. So here, I'll just kind of let you take a look at this image first here. So the frontal lobe is going to be elaboration of thought, the front of my brain. It's going to be involved in a lot of higher level thinking, motor control, memory, we used to think it was primarily in the frontal lobe, but we actually now know after research that memory is like throughout your entire brain. Um, Critical thinking, language, personality, all right up here in the frontal lobe. We'll talk about a guy named Phineas Gage who got a giant nail shot up his head and it pierced right through his frontal lobe. And he seemed more or less okay, believe it or not, but he had some major personality differences from before the accident versus after, and it was all due to damage in that frontal lobe where all his personality was kept. The parietal lobe is very much so sensory. So touch, pressure, pain, temperature, taste, hearing, speech, sound, all of that stuff is going to go right here and get processed in the parietal lobe. We can kind of think of it sort of in the back sort of half of your brain. The temporal lobe is going to be primarily hearing and smelling, and it's more on the sort of sides of the brain, the temporal lobes right here. And the occipital lobe is kind of tucked in underneath, and it's the anything related to vision. And so it's kind of crazy that there's an entire lobe of the brain dedicated to just vision. The temporal lobe contains areas associated with hearing and smell, so your ears and your nose. And then the parietal lobe does everything else in terms of sensory perception. So sensory information, so information in and action out, is controlled by three lobes, right? Parietal, occipital, and temporal, based off of which sense you're looking at. And then the frontal lobe does everything else for motor control. The frontal lobe is going to control all those appendages, control your voluntary movements, um, personality, higher level thinking, worrying, stress, relaxation, all that stuff is all happening up here. So let's kind of break those down a little bit. Frontal lobe, motor control, controls voluntary movements, links to memory, reasoning, critical thinking, language use, personality. So here's this guy, Phineas Gage. This poor dude had a giant 13-pound tamping rod, but let's just think of it as a giant rod or nail, pounded right through his head. Not only did he live, but he lived for 12 years after that accident and even walked around right after the accident. And damage was to his frontal lobes, right at the front there, okay, and to his left eye. Here was literally his brain. Like this is a diagram of his brain. So this is where it went. It wasn't something subtle. Like this was not fun. But he walked and he talked, and even after they got that out, he was still kind of living his best life. This is, by the way, what the rod looked like. There's a human skull. Oh, you can't really see it. Oh, sweet, I can move this. Okay, so this is the brain. This is his skull. This is the tamping rod we talked about. Went right through his brain. And so not very good, right? Went right into his temporal lobe. So what happened out of this? Well, here's images of where it went, of what it damaged. Now he underwent drastic surgeries to take it out. Before the surgery, he was polite, well-liked, and then after the surgery, after they removed the pole, after the accident, he was rude, short-tempered, divorced his wife. He was a horrible guy. His personality completely changed. Now, I mean, maybe having a pole would do that to you, but important part here to understand is that the frontal lobe has all that personality. It was damaged. So when the damage in the frontal lobe occurred, all the areas where his memories and his personalities were sort of all the way who you are, your essence as a person, specifically you, is all up there in that frontal lobe. The amount of damage that happened to Phineas here, after this accident, drastically damaged the neurons in that area of the frontal lobe, and therefore, yes, very obviously affected his personality. But unfortunate for Phineas, but good for the rest of us and for science, we kind of figured out what can happen when you damage the frontal lobe, and we better understood what the frontal lobe did. And so, unfortunately, or history sees this as very unfortunately, this is kind of what started the idea of a lobotomy. So if you want to Google lobotomies, you can. There were a dark time in the mid-late 50s to try and treat various different abnormalities in personality. Where basically, if you didn't like the way somebody was, because they were a little bit, crazy in whatever term we want to use that word for, a lot of people were misdiagnosed in this era as well, by the way, but it could have been anything from hyperactive disorders or excessive just excitability. I mean, I probably would have been diagnosed with all the things in the 50s standards of psychology. And so what you would have done to sort of make somebody more chill and docile is you would have taken a sort of an ice pick and stuck it up their nose or through their eye. People got good at going through the kind of corners of the eyes, um, like behind the eyeball, and they would kind of wiggle around and just jumble up the frontal lobe as best they could by going through this region here. And by damaging the frontal lobe, much like in Phineas, you change the personalities of those individuals. Essentially, you neutered their frontal lobe, but at the time, it was seen to be a wonderful procedure that had some wonderful, wonderful results. There's so much on YouTube about lobotomies. Very interesting time in science. Horrible, 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 horrible time in science. When this is one of those things where medicine is constantly needing to undergo review because it was touted as a wonderful medical procedure. I don't know, 70, 80 years ago now, but not so much anymore, right? We would never dare to do it. It's a very dark time in psychology and a very dark time in mental health and a very dark time in medicine. But at the time, it seemed to be a wonderful procedure, a groundbreaking procedure. So Google that if you're interested, lobotomies. Parietal lobe is kind of, like I said, up here at the back. And its sensory area is specifically associated with touch, pressure, pain, temperature, taste. It's also linked to emotions and some interpretation of speech. The temporal lobe, sensory information associated specifically with hearing and smell. But interestingly enough, we used to think that, like I said, memories were just up here in the frontal lobe, but we actually realized that certain memories for certain senses are stored in other parts of the brain. So, for example, we now know that memories associated with different smells are going to activate regions of the temporal lobe as well as the frontal lobe. So memories aren't just in one place, memories are sort of consolidated across the entire brain. Occipital lobe, kind of at the back of the brain, associated with vision and damage to the occipital lobes. If you hit the back of your head, which is why you used to wear a helmet, kids, is detrimental to your vision. Okay, I always show this photo. This is called the homunculus. So Google homunculus. There's different versions of it, but based off of the amount of sort of brain matter given to certain parts of the body in the brain, you could create an image that looked like this. Okay, this guy on the right here. This creepy dude, which nobody ever wants to see ever in real life, really shows us a lot. Now notice what parts of the body have less emphasis in the brain's matter and what parts of the body have more emphasis in the brain's matter. Really cool here. Look how big this guy's hands are. So much of your brain is responsible for motor control of your hands. Think about the amount of manipulation you can do. I can pick up my cell phone, I can interact with it in such small detail using the buttons. I can pick up cups, I can hold them in every kind of way. I can put it up to my mouth, I can tip it upside down, I can use a pen, I can write. Like there's so much that I can do. I can hit things hard, I can touch things softly. Like there's so much control. Never mind the feelings. I can touch cold things, like my laptop's cold, my table is rough, my window is cold. Like I can feel these things. This is all very specifically dedicated in the brain, and it's given a lot of sort of real estate in the brain. Muscles, sensory control, motor control, sensory information in your shoulders, arms, torso, not very important, right? Your feet are larger compared to other things in the body, but not as large as the hands, and that makes sense. I can't do as much with my feet, right? I really can't. I can't do as much as my feet. I can't move things the same way. I don't have the same motor control. I don't have the same sensory control in my feet as I do my hands. Makes sense. My brain hasn't really allowed it. Notice how other areas, other sensory areas, ears, nose, eyes, mouth. Look how big the mouth is compared to your ears. Your ears need to hear a lot, but your mouth articulates and tastes, and it changes shape depending on words, different languages, making different sounds. Your mouth has to work different ways to speak different languages or to eat different foods. And so look at the amount of sensory motor dedication that the brain gives the face in general. Also, look at like things like the genitals. The genitals have a larger, not a huge, but a larger than other parts of the body emphasis in the body because it's a highly sensitive area, vital for like reproduction. So evolutionarily, it has created a larger sort of real estate in the brain, or has been given a larger real estate in the brain rather. Okay, so here's how you spell homunculus if you want to Google it. Very creepy, but very cool in terms of understanding how the brain organizes information and what it emphasizes over other things. And that's it. So I'm going to end this video here. We've talked about the brain and the spinal cord, and now we'll talk about some other parts of the nervous system specifically, like the eye and the ear and taste and touch and stuff like that over the next couple videos. Thanks, guys.